Why does the tiniest strip of land on Earth ignite global chaos? Why do nations rise and fall around one ancient city, Jerusalem? This isn't just about borders or politics, it's prophecy. The Bible reveals Israel's past, present, and terrifying future in shocking detail, from divine promises to demonic betrayals, from miraculous rebirth to apocalyptic war. What if the headlines you're seeing right now were written thousands of years ago? What if the next world war begins here? Stay with us. What you're about to discover will shake your understanding of history, faith, and destiny. This is the biblical destiny of Israel. Before there was Israel, there was only desert vast, silent, forgotten. No cities, no armies, just dust, stars, and one man walking with nothing but a whisper from heaven. His name was Abram. No last name, no legacy, just obedience. And to him, God spoke a promise that would alter the fate of the world. "Leave your country," the voice said, "and go to a land I will show you." It wasn't about real estate. It was about destiny. That land, rocky, contested, narrow, and small, would become the epicenter of divine history. God didn't choose Egypt, mighty and majestic. He didn't choose Babylon, brilliant and advanced. He chose a strip of wilderness that seemed to hold no future. But that's how God writes his stories, in places no one expects, with people no one would choose. Abram obeyed. He left the familiar for the unknown, and with each step through Canaan's rough terrain, heaven etched a covenant into the soil. "To your descendants I will give this land, not rented, not borrowed, given, forever." This wasn't a casual deal, it was a blood-bound agreement sealed with sacrifice. God himself walked between the pieces. Fire passed through death, a divine signature written in flame. This land, this future Israel, was not claimed through war or wealth. It was gifted by eternity. But with the promise came a cost. The land was chosen, yes, but chosen for fire, chosen for testing, chosen for glory. It would bleed under empires, burn with rebellion, and groan with prophecy. The very soil would carry the weight of heaven's plan. Here, kings would rise and fall, prophets would cry out, blood would be spilled and scrolls would be written. Every stone, every olive tree, would bear silent witness to God's unfolding story. And though Abram never saw cities or temples, he walked with vision. Hebrews 11 says he looked for a city with foundations whose builder is God. That's the heartbeat of Israel, not just land, but legacy. Not just geography, but prophecy. To the world, it's a flashpoint. To God, it's a canvas. The story of Israel didn't begin with politics, it began with fire and faith, with a God who calls and a man who says yes. And even now, that ancient covenant still echoes. The headlines may change, the borders may shift, but the promise does not. Israel was not just born, it was called, and that call still burns. The covenant didn't rest, it moved, alive through generations, threading its way through time like a burning fuse. From the moment Isaac was born, laughter in the mouth of a barren woman and a miracle in the arms of a 100-year-old man, God's promise took form in flesh. But promises provoke enemies. As Isaac grew, so did the tension. The sons of Hagar mocked the child of Sarah. The lineage of the covenant was already under fire, and the conflict was more than sibling rivalry, it was a spiritual war waged through bloodlines. When Isaac became a man, the blessing passed to his son Jacob, not without struggle. Even in the womb, Jacob and Esau wrestled, and the battle between them would echo through history. Israel and Edom, covenant and compromise, spirit and flesh. Jacob, the heel grabber, the schemer, the unlikely vessel, he didn't earn the blessing. He clung to it, fought for it, limped away from an encounter with God, marked and renamed, no longer Jacob, now Israel, he who wrestles with God. That name wasn't just a title, it was a prophecy. Israel would always be a nation that wrestled, with faith, with obedience, with enemies seen and unseen. And the enemies came swiftly, from Pharaoh's slaughter of Hebrew infants to Amalek's ambush in the wilderness. Every generation of covenant bearers faced extermination. Why? Because Satan knew the promise. He heard the words spoken to Abraham that through this seed all nations would be blessed. If he could break the line, he could stop the blessing. The battles weren't just about borders or power. They were assassination attempts on a prophecy. But the covenant held. Through famine, through exile, through slavery and wandering, it held. And every attempt to snuff it out only ignited it further. The more Pharaoh oppressed, the more Israel multiplied. The more they wandered, the more God provided. Manna in the morning, fire by night. The covenant was not fragilite, was forged in fire, tempered by testing. This wasn't just a family story, it was the unfolding of a divine blueprint. God was creating a nation to carry his name, his laws, his glory. And that made Israel a threat not just to empires, but to darkness itself. The land they were promised was never empty. It had giants, fortified cities, and resistance waiting. Because destiny always meets opposition. And Israel's destiny wasn't survival, it was revelation. They weren't called to blend in, but to stand apart, to shine. But to shine, they would have to bleed. To carry the promise, they would have to walk through pain. This was the price of the covenant. And though the story was just beginning, the war had already begun. Slavery had become their shadow for 100 years of chains, silence, and back-breaking labor beneath Egypt's sun. The cries of Israel had risen like smoke, echoing through heaven until God moved, not just to rescue, but to reveal. When he called Moses from a burning bush, it wasn't just to liberate a people, it was to declare himself to a nation that didn't yet know his name. "I am," he said, "not a god of Egypt, not a distant deity, the God of their fathers." And with that, the countdown to deliverance began. Egypt didn't give up its slaves easily. 10 plagues split the sky, darkened the sun, shattered economies, and mocked every idol. Each judgment wasn't random, it was strategic. God was not only delivering his people, he was dismantling Egypt's gods one by one. And in the final hour, beneath the blood-soaked doorposts, death passed over. That night, Israel walked out free, trembling but untouched. But freedom wasn't the end, it was the beginning. God didn't bring them out just to roam. He brought them out to meet him. And so they came to Sinai. It wasn't a gentle introduction. The mountain shook, thunder cracked, fire swallowed the summit, and a trumpet blasted from an invisible realm. God descended in smoke and flame, and Israel stood before something the world had never seen. A nation summoned to a wedding with the divine. This was more than law, it was covenant. "If you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession," God declared. It wasn't a contract, it was a marriage, and the terms were sacred. But covenants sealed by heaven are always opposed by hell. Even before Moses descended with the commandments carved by God's own hand, Israel had already betrayed the vow. A golden calf danced in their camp while fire still burned on the mountain. The honeymoon was broken before it began. Yet God didn't walk away. Instead, he revealed something deeper, mercy that mingled with justice. He would stay, he would lead, but he would not make the journey easy. Because Sinai was not just a mount of revelation, it was preparation for war. The land they were headed for wasn't vacant, it was hostile. Giants waited, pagan altars stood tall. This wasn't just about land, it was about who would be worshipped there. And God didn't choose Israel because they were strong. He chose them to show that he was. At Sinai, Israel wasn't just freed, they were forged. A nation of slaves became a people of destiny, wrapped not in gold but in glory. And the fire that fell on the mountain didn't die, settled over a people marked for something eternal. The world had never seen anything like it. A God who chose a nation not for power, but for presence. But presence would come with a cost. This wedding would be tested in the wilderness and in war. Long before its gates were built, before kings rode through its streets or prophets wept on its walls, Jerusalem was already in God's mind. A hill in the land of Moriah where Abraham once lifted a knife over his promised son was marked with something eternal. Centuries later, David would take that same hill from the Jebusites and name it the capital of Israel. But make no mistake, this wasn't David's idea. It was heaven's blueprint unfolding. Jerusalem wasn't chosen by strategy, It was chosen by sovereignty. This city would become the stage where heaven and earth collide, a place where priests lifted incense, where blood from the altar ran down stone, and where the very presence of God rested between the wings of cherubim. It was here Solomon built the temple, not just a building, but a throne room for the invisible king. And when that temple was dedicated, fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, and glory filled the courts so thick the priests couldn't even stand. No other city on earth had ever hosted God like this. No other city ever will. But glory always draws conflict. What God selects, Satan opposes. And so Jerusalem, the city of peace, became the epicenter of war. Babylon burned it, Rome crushed it, Islam claimed it, empires bled to own it, nations rose to surround it. The world doesn't fight over Cairo or Damascus or Athens the way it fights over Jerusalem. Why? Because the battle isn't political, it's prophetic. Satan knows what's been written. He knows this city is not just sacred, it's strategic. And he will stop at nothing to desecrate what God has destined. But God never changed his mind. Though the temple was torn down, the stones still carry weight. Though the ark is missing, the mountain still remembers. And the prophets saw a future where Jerusalem rises again, not just as a capital, but as a crown. Zechariah declared it would be a burdensome stone for all nations. Isaiah saw it lifted as the highest of hills. And Jesus? He wept over it not just for its past, but for its future. He knew the days ahead, the betrayal, the trampling, the wars, but he also knew the end. That one day, his feet would touch the Mount of Olives. That one day, he would rule from this city not in metaphor, but in flesh and glory. Jerusalem is more than history, it is destiny. More than stone, it is prophecy. And whether it's in ashes or adorned, the calling on this city is eternal. It will be attacked, it will be divided, but it will never be erased. Because in the end, when the kingdoms of men have fallen and the nations rage one last time, it will be Jerusalem, God's chosen hill, that welcomes the king. The land had been promised, the temple built, and the presence of God had once filled it with fire, but Israel's heart wandered. The very people who had seen the Red Sea split, who heard thunder roll at Sinai, who watched fire fall in Solomon's day, slowly traded intimacy for idolatry. They bowed to golden calves, to Baal and Asherah, to gods of stone that never spoke. Prophets cried out, warning of judgment, pleading for repentance, but their voices were drowned beneath the noise of rebellion. The covenant hadn't changed, but Israel had, and judgment came like a flood. Babylon didn't just attack, it swallowed. Nebuchadnezzar breached the walls, burned the temple, stripped the ark, and carried off the best and brightest into exile. Jerusalem, once called the city of God, became a heap of ruins. The land that flowed with milk and honey now sat silent under the weight of judgment. For 70 years, the people wept by foreign rivers. Their harps hung on trees, their songs turned to ashes. To many, it seemed the promise had died, that God's favor had expired. That exile was final. But that's not how God writes endings. Because even in exile, he was working. Even in judgment, he was remembering. Through prophets like Jeremiah, he whispered hope, I will bring you back. Through Daniel, he revealed timelines. Through Ezekiel, he breathed life into bones. The God who scattered was now stirring. And then, the unthinkable Cyrus, a Persian king who didn't even know God, issued a decree, go home, rebuild the temple, restore what was lost. Who does that? Only a God who never forgets the covenant he made even when his people do. So they returned, not in chariots, not in strength, but in remnants. Stones were raised again, the altar rekindled, walls rebuilt. Ezra read the law. Nehemiah fought with one hand on a sword and the other on a brick. Slowly, painfully, Israel began to breathe again. But the cycle didn't end there, because rebellion returns in disguise, in pride, in religion without presence, in lip service without heart surrender. And even when Jesus walked their streets healing the sick, raising the dead, fulfilling every prophecy, they rejected him. The temple that had once held God's glory now plotted to kill God in flesh. And once again, judgment followed. In 70 AD, Rome flattened Jerusalem. The temple burned. Israel scattered again. But even still, the promise remained. Because the story of Israel is not one of perfection, it's one of return. Again and again, they fall. Again and again, God brings them back. In 1948, after nearly 2,000 years in exile, Israel was reborn, a nation born in a day, just as Isaiah had foretold. But the real return isn't just to the land, it's to the Lord. And that return is still unfolding. The same cycle that played out in Babylon is playing out now. Rebellion, exile, mercy, restoration. The promise hasn't died, it's waking up. He didn't ride in with legions behind him. No crown, no sword, no parade of warriors. Just a borrowed donkey, dusty roads, and the sound of palm branches hitting stone. The people shouted, "Hosanna!" expecting revolution. But Jesus came not to overthrow Rome, but to overthrow sin. He wasn't there to sit on a throne, he was there to hang on a cross, and that confused everyone. They wanted a lion. He came as a lamb. Jerusalem had waited for centuries. Prophets had pointed. Scriptures had whispered. Every feast, every sacrifice, every psalm, they were all rehearsals for this moment. And yet, when he came, the city missed him. "If only you had known," he said through tears, "even you, on this day, what would bring you peace." But they didn't. Their eyes were open, but their hearts were closed. The religious leaders, threatened by his authority and blinded by pride, chose Caesar over the Christ. "We have no king but Caesar," they shouted. And with that, they sealed the first shaking. The temple, once filled with glory, now echoed with betrayal. The courts where God's name was lifted now echoed with the sound of 30 silver coins hitting the floor. And Jesus, the very fulfillment of the law, was dragged outside the city gates to die between thieves, rejected, scourged, crucified. But make no mistake, this wasn't a loss, it was a setup. Because rejection wasn't the end of Israel's story, it was the beginning of the world's redemption. At that moment, the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom, not by human hands, but by heaven itself. The separation between God and man was shattered. The blood of bulls could never do what this one sacrifice did. And though Israel had rejected her Messiah, God was still working through that rejection. Redemption wasn't cancelled, it was accelerated. But consequences came. In 70 AD, Rome returned. Not to negotiate, but to crush. Titus marched on Jerusalem with fury. The temple, the very heart of Jewish life, was burned to the ground. Stones thrown down, just as Jesus had said. Not one left upon another. Blood ran in the streets. Survivors were scattered. Exile began again. And yet, even then, God wasn't done. Because in that shaking, something eternal was planted. The gospel would go to the Gentiles. The seed of salvation would be sown across the earth. And one day, the same people who shouted, "Crucify him," would echo a different cry. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Rejection was not the final word. Jesus knew it. The prophets saw it. And Israel, even now, is inching closer to that revelation. The first shaking broke what was, but it also made room for what will be. The smoke from the burning temple curled into the sky like a final lament. Rome had come, and this time there would be no rebuilding, no miraculous escape, no Moses, no David. The city that once hosted the glory of God was now soaked in blood and rubble. Titus, the Roman general, tore through Jerusalem like a storm from hell. The temple was dismantled stone by stone, just as Jesus had prophesied. Not one block left upon another. And as the fire consumed the holy place, the last light of national Israel was extinguished at least for a time. What followed was not just exilite, was erasure. The Jewish people were hunted, enslaved, scattered across continents. They fled north to Europe, west to Africa, east into Asia. Some were paraded through Rome as trophies. Others lived in the shadows of foreign empires. building new lives while carrying ancient pain. Israel, once a kingdom with borders and kings, became a people without a home. But the dispersion wasn't a historical accident. It was written. Moses had warned them. "If you turn from my covenant," God said through him, "you will be uprooted and scattered among the nations." The prophets echoed it. Jeremiah wept over it. Jesus walked its edges. And yet, even in the scattering, hope was never lost, because the same verses that promised dispersion also whispered return. For 2,000 years, the Jewish people wandered. Pogroms in Europe, ghettos, expulsions, Holocaust, each chapter more brutal than the last, and yet they never disappeared. No other ancient people group has survived such displacement without losing language, culture, or identity. But Israel did, because God wasn't finished. The dispersion was discipline, no destruction. And in the quiet cracks of time, the prophet's words waited. Ezekiel saw it. Dry bones scattered across a valley, lifeless, brittle, forgotten. But then breath came, flesh returned. Bone met bone, and a nation stood again. That wasn't just a metaphor, it was a preview. Isaiah asked, "Can a nation be born in a day?" The answer came on May 14, 1948. After millennia of wandering, Israel was reborn. A flag raised, a people returned. From the ashes of Auschwitz to the deserts of Zion. From Russia, Ethiopia, Yemen, Iran, America, they came home. Not because it was politically convenient, but because it was prophetically inevitable. The God who scattered had kept every name, every heartbeat, every promise. The dispersion proved the covenant was real, but the return proves it's unbreakable. Israel's rebirth wasn't a fluke of history, it was a fulfillment of prophecy, and the world, whether it understood or not, had just witnessed the resurrection of a nation written in scripture thousands of years before. The great dispersion had ended, the clock had restarted, and heaven had set the stage for what comes next. They said it could never happen, that a people scattered for 2,000 years could never return, that languages die, cultures dissolve, identities vanish after just a few generations in exile. But Israel didn't vanish. She waited. And on May 14, 1948, the impossible happened. A nation was born. In one day, in fulfillment of prophecy, the dry bones stood up. It wasn't just political. It wasn't just the UN. It was Ezekiel 37 breathing into real time. He saw it in a Vizhuna valley of bones, dry, lifeless, beyond hope. And then a question from God, can these bones live? It was more than a question. It was a challenge to everything logic had ever said. Ezekiel didn't know, but God did. And when the breath came, bone met bone, sinews formed, and life returned to what the world had declared dead. That vision wasn't poetic, it was prophetic. From the ashes of the Holocaust, survivors stepped off boats and planes and kissed the dust of a forgotten homeland. Russian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Iraqi Jews generations born in exile, who had never seen Zion with their own eyes, came home with fire in their hearts. Hebrew, once considered a dead language, was reborn on the tongues of schoolchildren. Fields long barren bloomed, cities rose, and the Star of David flew once more over the hills of Jerusalem. But make no mistake, this wasn't welcomed. From the moment the declaration was signed, 5 Arab nations declared war. Israel had no tanks, no real army, no allies, but they had prophecy, and they survived. Then came 1967. In 6 days, against all odds, they not only held their ground, they expanded it. Jerusalem was back in their hands for the first time in almost 20 years. That's not politics, that's destiny. Still, the question remains, was this the end of the story or the beginning of the end? Because while Israel returned, not all of her heart did. The bones lived, but did the spirit awaken? The secular state rose, but the covenant still waits to be fully embraced. Prophecy doesn't end with rebirth, it accelerates. Israel's restoration to the land is only the first act. What comes next will shake the world. Ezekiel said the bones would come together first. Then the breath would come. That moment of awakening, of revelation, of national revival is still coming. But it starts here, with a flag raised over a land that refuses to disappear, with a people who, against all human odds, walked back into a promise that never died. The world saw a miracle in 1948, but prophecy sees a countdown. Israel is back. The dry bones are standing. The clock is ticking, and heaven is watching. Israel was reborn in a day, but peace was not. No sooner had the flag been raised than the sirens began. 5 Arab armies attacked within hours of her independence. It didn't stop there. War followed war. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. Terror, intifadas, rockets, blood in the streets of Tel Aviv, sirens over Jerusalem. Israel wasn't welcomed back to the neighborhood she was targeted. And the enemies weren't random, they were named. Psalm 83 isn't just a prayer, it's a prophecy. A cry from Asaph, calling on God not just for help, but for recognition. They have said, "Come, let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more." It's chilling. A coalition of nations surrounding Israel, united by a single goal: erasure. Look at the map today: Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria, proxies in Iraq, Iran funding them all, with Turkey and others stirring. The psalm reads like a headline: Edom, Moab, Ammon, Gebel, Amalek, Tyre, Philistia, the ancient names of modern threats. Different faces, same spirit, not just political opposition, but spiritual resistance. The land was promised by God, and the enemies of God still rage against that promise. This is not just about borders or politics, it's about prophecy, about a war that didn't start in 1948, but in Genesis, about a serpent that still wants to crush what God has blessed. Israel stands today, but she stands surrounded, and still she survives, not because of strength alone, but because of purpose. The Psalm 83 coalition wants silence. God promises survival, and He has preserved her through fire because her destiny is not yet fulfilled. But here's the question few dare ask. Could this growing pressure be the setup for a much larger storm? Could the alliances forming now between Iran and Russia, between Turkey and radical factions, be the prelude to Gog and Magog? Could the hatred aimed at Israel today be ancient prophecy waking up in our generation? Because Psalm 83 doesn't just name enemies, it hints at an endgame, one where Israel is backed into a corner and only God can deliver. This isn't fear-mongering, it's scripture, and we're watching it unfold. The world sees another skirmish, another ceasefire, another peace talk, but heaven sees the nations gathering. The psalm ends not in despair but in declaration. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, are the Most High over all the earth. Israel is surrounded, yes, but she is also surrounded by prophecy. And when God surrounds a nation, no enemy ancient or modern can prevail. This isn't just a war zone, it's a countdown. The psalm has been written, the players are in place, and the stage is set for something far bigger than anyone imagines. Something is stirring on the Temple Mount. You can feel it in the tension, see it in the headlines, hear it in the arguments rising over every stone. It's the most contested piece of real estate on earth, just 35 acres of sacred ground. And yet, it holds the future of the world in its dust, because according to prophecy, everything will begin and end right here. For centuries, the Jewish people have prayed toward this place, 3 times a day, mourning what was lost, longing for what must return. The first temple built by Solomon was a house of glory. Fire fell. God's presence filled the courts, but sin crept in, and Babylon burned it down. The second temple was raised in tears, then expanded by Herod into a monument of splendor. It was standing when Jesus walked its halls, but he didn't praise its beauty, he prophesied its fall. Not one stone will be left upon another. And in 70 AD, Rome made sure of it. Now, only the Western Wall remains. But the longing remains too. And recently, that longing has turned into plans. Blueprints have been drawn. Garments for priests have been sewn. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has reconstructed sacred vessels, menorahs, Altar 7 trained Levites in ceremonial law. Red heifers biblically required for purification have been bred and imported. The world shrugs. But prophecy leans in, because the Bible is clear. A third temple will rise. Daniel spoke of it. Jesus warned of it. Paul confirmed it. Revelation describes it, not as a symbol of worship, but as a stage of deception. Because what begins in holiness will be hijacked by hell. Halfway through the tribulation, the Antichrist will step into that Templar not to honor God, but to declare himself as God. The abomination of desolation, a moment so blasphemous it causes the earth to convulse. Jesus said, "When you see it, flee." It's not metaphor, it's a warning. And here's what makes this moment different. For the first time in 20 years, the pieces are in place. The desire is real. The infrastructure exists. The political storm around the mount is boiling. The global chaos is increasing. The push for peace is intensifying. And behind it all, a hunger for a return to the sacredun that could open the door to something catastrophic. Is the third temple already in motion? Is the world standing one breath away from the final deception? The nations don't see it coming, but the prophets did. And it's not a question of if, it's only when. Because this temple, when it rises, won't just be made of stone. It will be a trigger, a signal, a countdown. And when that day comes, the world will know that prophecy has stepped out of scripture and onto center stage. The third temple is not a rumor, it's a warning, and the hour draws near. It's just a city small, ancient, perched on the hills of Judea. No oil, no major rivers, no towering skyscrapers, and yet the world cannot look away. Presidents argue over it, terrorists target it, diplomats tiptoe around it. Wars are waged in its shadow. Peace talks collapse at its mention. Why? Because Zechariah 12 said it would happen. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about. It's not poetic, it's prophetic, and it's happening right now. Jerusalem is the only city God says He placed His name upon forever. It's the only city where heaven and earth have kissed, where blood and blessing flows side by side. It's where Abraham raised the knife over Isaac, where David danced before the ark, where Solomon built a throne for the presence of God. It's where Jesus wept, bled, and rose. And it's where He will return. No other city has carried such divine weight. And because of that, no other city has drawn such rage. The world wants it divided. The UN has passed resolution after resolution, declaring Jerusalem not the capital of Israel, but a shared space, a negotiable peace. But God never called it negotiable. He called it His. And the more the world presses to split it, the more unstable it becomes. A trembling, cup-spilling fear, violence, and judgment on those who try to hold it by force. Terrorists see it as a symbol of defiance. Politicians see it as leverage. Religions see it as sacred ground. But few see it for what it truly is: a countdown clock. Every embassy moved, every stone thrown, every headline written about Jerusalem moves us one step closer to what the prophets foresaw. The world doesn't understand it, but the spirit realm does. Because Jerusalem isn't just the capital of Israel, it's the epicenter of the last war. Zechariah goes further. All the nations of the earth will gather against it. Not just neighbors, not just radicals, all nations. That means this conflict won't stay regional, it will become global. And when it does, the earth will shake not because Jerusalem is strong, but because it's sacred. God will not allow this city to be divided by human hands when He has destined it to be the throne of His Son. The nations rage, the councils scheme, but the King is coming, and when His feet touch the Mount of Olives, the trembling will stop not because man solved the conflict, but because God stepped in. So yes, Jerusalem is trembling, but it's not because it's fragile. It's because it carries a fire that cannot be quenched. And soon, that fire will consume every plan that rises against it. This city is not just a battleground, it's the battleground. And the world is on edge, because deep down, it knows the final hour will strike here. Ezekiel saw it long before the alliances ever formed, before the tanks rolled, before the satellite images showed troop movements, before the headlines whispered about war. He saw a storm rising from the north, a coalition bound not by proximity, but by hatred. Gog, of the land of Magog, a prince, a power, a dark figure leading nations against the mountains of Israel. This isn't myth, it's not metaphor. It's written in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and what was once dismissed as distant prophecy is now casting a shadow over current events. Look at the map, look at the headlines. Russia moves with boldness in Eastern Europe and cozies up to Iran with military ties. Iran, armed and defiant, funds proxies that encircle Israel like wolves waiting for the gate to break. Turkey, once friendly, now shifts toward authoritarian Islamism, sharpening its tone and testing Israel's patience. Sudan, Libya nations in chaos, yet aligned through back channels and deals, drawn like iron filings to a magnetic center of unrest. The stage is set. The alliances Ezekiel named are not just possible, they are plausible. And they are forming. But this war won't be like the others. It won't be a skirmish over land or water or politics. It will be about annihilation. The goal will not be peace talks or treaties, it will be the erasure of Israel from the map. Let us go up against a land of unwalled villages. Gog says, to seize, spoil, and carry off plunder. But this war is different for another reason, because God himself steps in. Ezekiel doesn't mince words. As the armies surround Israel, God declares, my fury will come up in my face. The earth will shake, mountains will crumble, pestilence, torrential rain, fire, brimstone turns into a weapon in the hand of its creator. And the armies? They will turn on each other. Confusion will set in. What begins as an invasion ends in collapse. Not by human defense, but by divine interruption. Why? Because this is not just about military power, it's about revealing God's hand. Ezekiel 38:23 is the climax. So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and make myself known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This war is not just judgment, it's revelation. And what about Israel? Outnumbered, surrounded, cornered, yet preserved not by iron domes or intelligence agencies, but by the God who promised Abraham his descendants would never be uprooted again. The nations will rage, the missiles will fly, the coalition will march. But when the dust settles, it won't be Gog who is remembered, it will be God. The invasion is coming, but so is the intervention. Gog will rise, but God will roar. And when it's over, the world will know. Israel didn't survive by luck. She survived because prophecy said she would. Because God said, this land is mine. It begins with peace, a signature on parchment, smiles before cameras. The world exhales, believing the conflict is over. Israel, long weary of war, agrees to a covenant that promises safety, a treaty brokered by a leader who seems to have all the answers. He speaks of tolerance, unity, and coexistence. He calms tensions between ancient enemies. Jerusalem breathes for the first time in decades. The temple is rebuilt. Sacrifices resume. The world applauds. Prophecy leans in. Because what looks like peace is actually the bait of war. Daniel spoke of it. Paul warned of it. Jesus described it with urgency. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, that's the moment. Halfway into this supposed peace, a sudden turn. The same leader who brokered the deal walks into the temple, not to honor God, but to replace him. He declares himself divine. He demands worship. He exalts himself above all that is called holy. And in that blasphemous act, the curtain is torn again, not by grace, but by judgment. The mask comes off. The Antichrist reveals his true face. And what follows is not diplomacy, it is devastation. The second half of the 7-year period begins what Jesus called the Great Tribulation. But to Israel, it's more personal. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, a time so dark, so violent, so intense, it eclipses all that came before it. And yet, it was written. Persecution ignites. Those who refuse the mark are hunted. Believers are martyred. A global system, rise economic, spiritual, political under one man, one law, one demand, worship or die. Israel, realizing the betrayal too late, becomes the focal point of wrath. The covenant is broken, the temple defiled, the city surrounded, and yet the story does not end there, because God did not bring Israel this far to abandon her. Just as he preserved her in Egypt, Babylon, and under Roman fire, he will preserve her again. A remnant flees into the wilderness, into the mountains, into the shadow of prophecy. Revelation speaks of it, a place prepared by God, protected, hidden, because what the enemy means for extermination, God will use for revelation. This is the shaking, the refining, the moment when Israel's eyes begin to open, not through comfort, but through crisis, through fire, the veil begins to lift. The same people who once said, "We have no king but Caesar," begin to ache for a different king, the one they pierced, the one they missed, the one who never stopped watching. The Great Tribulation is not just a time of wrath, it's a time of awakening. So will Israel survive? Not just survive, she will awaken. She will remember, and she will call on the name of the Lord. Because written into the furnace of prophecy is a miracle. Out of the ashes of Jacob's trouble comes the revelation of Israel's redemption, and it's coming, fast. When the sky grows darkest, prophecy begins to shine. The nations rage, the armies march. Israel is surrounded, bloodied, bruised. The covenant looks shattered, the promise nearly extinguished. But then, something shifts. Not geopolitics, not alliances, something deeper, spiritual, eternal. A cry rises from the remnant not for escape, but for truth. And in that moment, Zechariah's words unfold in fire. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced. It's not poetry, it's revelation. For 2,000 years, Israel has carried the scriptures but missed the sun. They knew the words but not the word made flesh. They built synagogues but turned from the carpenter. They waited for Messiah, not realizing he had already come, riding on a donkey, crowned with thorns, rejected in love. But now, in the furnace of tribulation, their blindness begins to burn away. The veil lifts, the wounds are seen, and they weep not in condemnation, but in recognition. Like Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, the Messiah stands before them not in wrath, but in mercy. The one they pierced is not holding a sword, he's holding scars. And the grief that follows is not political, it's personal. They shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, not because they fear judgment, but because they see how long they've been blind to the love that never left them. This is not a private moment, it's national. The revival doesn't come from a tent meeting or a televangelist. It erupts from the soil of suffering and remembrance. Hearts begin to burn as scripture's long read becomes suddenly alive. Isaiah 53 is no longer confusing, it's clear. Psalm 22 is no longer metaphor, it's memory. The Messiah they rejected is the Redeemer they embrace. And heaven doesn't stay silent. Angels prepare for a coronation. Saints lean forward. The king who stood silent before Pilate now prepares to descend in fire and glory. But he doesn't come to condemn, he comes to claim. Not just the earth, but his people. The same feet that walked Galilee will now touch the Mount of Olives. The same hands that healed lepers will now wipe away the tears of a nation reborn. This moment changes everything. It is the hinge of history, the turn from tribulation to triumph. The world will tremble, but Israel will awaken. And from their cry, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," the clouds will break. The Lion of Judah will return, and the one they pierced will reign, not just as Savior, but as King. The darkness will end, the veil is gone, the wounds are visible, and the eyes of Israel, once sealed in sorrow, will open wide in glory. This is not the end of their story. This is the moment they remember who they truly are, and more importantly, who he really is. The clouds split not softly, but with power. Lightning arcs across the sky. Trumpets sound, not from earth, but from heaven itself. And the one the nations mocked, the one they pierced, the one whose name they tried to erase, he returns. Not hidden in a manger, not riding a borrowed donkey, but crowned in glory, eyes like fire, robes dipped in blood, riding a white horse. And he's not coming back to Rome, not to New York, not to London. He's coming home to Zion. The Mount of Olives quakes beneath his feet. Zechariah saw it before it happened. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Not a metaphor, not a vision, a physical, unstoppable return. The same mountain where he wept, where he prayed, where he ascended, now splits in two under the weight of his majesty. And the armies of heaven ride behind him, not to invade, but to reclaim. This is not an idea. This is not a spiritual feeling. This is the King of Kings, stepping into real time, in real space, with real justice. The Antichrist is crushed, the false prophet silenced. The beast and his kingdom fall in an instant. The blood that cried from the ground is answered. The tears of the martyrs are vindicated. Israel, once trembling in the shadows, now stands in the light of her Redeemer. The city that was trampled, divided, desecratedis now lifted, crowned, and made new. Jerusalem becomes what it was always meant to be, not just a capital, but a crown. The throne of David is no longer vacant. The Son of David sits, not by election, not by revolution, but by divine right. The government is on his shoulders, and his kingdom will know no end. The nations gather not to war, but to worship. Weapons are melted into plowshares. Children play where sirens once screamed. The lion lies with the lamb. And from Zion, the word of the Lord goes forth to every corner of the earth. The curse is broken. Creation breathes again. Time slows. Peace reigns. This is not the end. This is the beginning of forever. Jesus returns to the very place where the story began, to the land of covenant, to the city of promise, to the people of prophecy, not as a teacher, not as a suffering servant, but as the rightful king. He was always coming back. And now, the waiting is over. The war is over. The lies are over. What began in a garden and was wrestled for in a wilderness and paid for on a cross, now rules from a throne. The king has returned to Zion, and nothing will ever be the same again. It's no longer distant. It's no longer theory. It's not just in scripture, it's in the streets. Iran funds proxies on every border. Hezbollah fires from the north. Hamas erupts in the south. Yemen, Syria, Iraq plays their part. Israel is not just fighting a local war. She's standing at the epicenter of a prophetic firestorm. And America? She's being pulled in. Step-by-step naval fleets in the Red Sea. Air bases on alert. Military warnings echoing across the world stage. This is not just defense. It's alignment. It's division. It's the nations gathering. Ezekiel 38 was never about ancient namesit, was about modern alliances. Iran and Russia now shake hands. China watches. Turkey wavers. And the global system whispers for a solution, a leader, a broker, a false messiah. The Abraham Accords once offered hope. Now, they tremble under the weight of war. UN resolutions multiply. Anti-Israel protests swell. Jerusalem bleeds. But Zechariah 12 said it would happen. The cup of trembling has been poured. Israel is not just fighting for land, she's fulfilling prophecy. The world is not just watching, it's walking into its final hour. And you? You're not just a viewer. You're living in the most prophetic generation in history. The king is coming, the clock is moving, and the war you're seeing is not the end, it's the signal. Watch Israel, watch Jerusalem, watch the alliances form, because what the prophets saw is now on your screen.